shedding is real. And the reason why I'm saying it's real is the FDA knows it's real. They state that all gene therapy products should undergo shedding studies, not only in animals, but in humans. And that's a problem. They were not done.
In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Pierre co-founder of the FLCCC Alliance and former chief of the Critical Care Service at the University of Wisconsin.
You get babies with strokes and facial paralysis and respiratory arrest and seizures after breastfeeding.
What is shedding? What evidence is there that the COVID-19 genetic vaccines cause it? And what kinds of people are affected? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kelly. Dr. Pierre Corey, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks, Jan. It's absolutely an honor.
Well, huge congratulations. We're here at the FLCCC meetings. It's a sold-out place. I mean, I saw people actually coming in last night trying to get places, and you're just like, no, we were trying. We filled every seat. It's remarkable how far FLCCC has come from a couple of years back.
It's astonishing. And it's really uplifting. We've struck a chord. I think we're doing work that is really appreciated widely, and you can see it in the spirit and the attendance, right? And the conversations that I've had, it's really good for the soul. We're doing the right thing. We're trying to be honest, open, transparent, and just giving sound guidance. And I think there's so little of that out there that people really appreciate that they have a place that they can come to.
And I also appreciate you must be telling your people about the Epoch Times, because there's no conference at which this many people are coming up to me thanking Epoch Times for their work, and most of them, frankly, I'd say 8 out of 10 have actually been medical doctors, and a number of them have told me that they're applying some of the things that we've been able to bring out in our reporting in their practices, which is I wasn't thinking about something like that being a possibility.
First of all, your health section is great because it's wide, it's not curated. You do deep dives on any number of promising therapies. But beyond that, I just want to say, I think I tweeted this a year or two ago. I said, the Epoch Times is the only functioning newspaper in the United States. And I literally mean that, because I find your reporting to be very objective. You look at both sides. In fact, you do such a good job, it gets me angry because I wouldn't call myself biased, but there are certain things that I know to be true, and you guys don't go there because you want to be measured. You want to make sure you have the evidence. And, I have very strong opinions where I don't have the evidence to support them, but I know they're right. And you guys can't do that in a newspaper. You're being true journalists. And, I appreciate the even-handed reporting and the accurate reporting that you guys can do.
Well, I appreciate those kind words. FLCCC, I've also noticed you put an inordinate focus on avoiding conflict of interest, which I really appreciate, and I think that's kind of compatible, I guess, with us as well.
Right.
I wanted to note that.
It's so important. I mean, as soon as you inject money into what you're doing, and it just starts to influence what you do, and then you can't be objective and transparent because you have to work for a financial interest.
It's difficult, right? We always have to navigate this, but the idea is to try to set it up as best as possible, right? Yeah. So let's talk about, I want to talk today about something very controversial, which is shedding of these COVID vaccine products. And that, there's been symptoms, people who have been close to people who have had the vaccine, some seem to get similar symptoms. And this has been anecdotal. There's been discussion of this. I don't even know how rigorously this has been treated. We're going to have this conversation, but I understand it's a real thing. And back in the day, I thought this was total cuckoo land.
Yep.
Initially.
Yep. And I got to say, I probably would agree with you. I mean, I know when the vaccines rolled out, that's the first thing that happened, right? Is social media started to make noise. And it was really driven by women. And there's very good reasons for that, who were reporting sudden menstrual abnormalities after years or decades of really regular cycles. And they were noticing that it started to happen. They were talking amongst their friends, and these women started to notice that their cycles were off, heavy bleeding, missed periods, things like that, painful periods. and they hadn't been vaccinated, but they were, everyone was getting vaccinated. And then there were social media groups where they started to talk about this and share. And then there was one group that started a website called My Cycle Story, where women were able to, relate these things. But when there's truth, when the fact checkers come after you, right? So those Facebook groups were disbanded. They were, deplatformed. There was articles saying how ludicrous this was. This is just social media craze. And so I'm like you. I kind of listened to it. I didn't know really what to make of it, and I didn't know what shedding really was and how that could be possible. But, I finally did the scientific research. So here was my evolution is, in fact, the first patient I treated was March of 2021. It was a woman who got to me through actually a podcast that I'd done an interview with. And she related that she had gone to a massage therapist who had gotten boosted the day before. And she came home that night, and I think she missed her period within 2 days. She had tender, swollen breasts. She was cramping. And she said she'd been so regular for the last 20 years. She was 43, I think. She said this was totally abnormal. And she really related it to that very close exposure to the massage therapist. And I didn't really know what to do for her. I knew ivermectin binds spike, and I thought maybe there was some shedding of spike, and I actually put her on ivermectin, and actually she got her period back. She hadn't had her period in, I think, about 6 or 8 weeks by the time she talked to me, and she still was very uncomfortable, and about 5 days after ivermectin, she got her period back. I had one other anecdote very similar to that, and then I didn't have any more for a long time, and then I opened my practice. And what happened is me and my partner, we started to see these phenomenon in our patients, some of them even vaccine-injured patients. So everybody thinks, shedding, it's only the unvaccinated who are screaming, right? The anti-vaxxers who are saying they're being shed upon. That's not true. I have vaccine-injured patients who are sensitive to being exposed to other vaccinated. And so it's not just unvaccinated who are at risk. And so we saw these phenomena. Now, one of the things, it's a small cohort that are sensitive to shedding phenomenon. I think shedding is very common, but how often can it actually affect someone else? That's very variable. And our best insight to this point, after doing a lot of research, talking with a lot of other clinicians, is that it tends to happen to people who are very sort of environmentally sensitive, either or pharmacologically sensitive, like they can't handle pharmaceuticals, environments, have allergies, things like that. And some of them are really quite sensitive, but that's why I think most of us are unaffected. I also think there's a cohort out there who are sensitive and they just don't know what's happening to them. I'll give you a great example. So 2 weeks ago, I was seeing a patient in follow-up, and it's a patient of mine who'd made significant progress. He's a vaccine-injured patient. And during the visit, we're talking, and he said, he's telling me all the things that are bothering him suddenly. And I was really disappointed because it was clearly a regression or a relapse. And he just spontaneously says, Dr. Corey, there's this other thing. He's like, I can't go into grocery stores anymore. He says, I go into Trader Joe's, and within about 5 minutes, I feel so terrible, I have to leave there. And then he says, and then yesterday, we were at a farmer's market. It was like a Sunday. He said, it was really crowded there. And again, I felt terrible, and I had to leave. And I said to him, well, you know what that is, right? Because I had written this huge series on all of my research on shedding, and many of my patients read my Substack. And he said, no, I don't read your Substack. And I said, well, that's shedding. What's shedding? And I explained it to him. And so there are people who don't know what's making them sick. And, I think with him now he's much better. He now knows to be cautious. But here's where I think we should start, Jan, if you don't mind. I do want to talk about that shedding is real. And the reason why I'm saying it's real is the FDA knows it's real, right? So if you think about the vaccines are not traditional vaccines. Clear to everyone, right? Something's different about them. Some people know exactly what they're new, but what they really are is they're defined as gene therapy products, right? And there's an FDA definition of a gene therapy in their document on shedding from 2015. And in that document, they state that a gene therapy is any time you inject genetic material, and that material then produces a product. Okay? Mm-hmm. Clearly, that's what these vaccines are, right? We inject mRNA makes spike, gene therapy. Okay. In that document, they state that all gene therapy products should undergo shedding studies, not only in animals, but in humans. And there's no shedding studies that have been done on these gene therapies. But if you look at the market of gene therapies, I have evidence of at least 4 products that are out there. In the inserts of each one, they note that they will shed. So one is for an eye disease. They said it secretes in the tears and in any of the drainage for up to a week. There's another one where it's 30 days in the feces where the products of that gene therapy sheds. And another one says 2 weeks. And so all of these other ones on the market, it's clearly in the insert. There was no insert here. In fact, what's even more astonishing and scary is we embarked on a global vaccination campaign with a gene therapy, which is in a category of therapeutic which is known to shed. All the other products on the market are shed, and yet never the discussion of shedding. And if you ever bring it up, if it ever shows up in a newspaper, again, fact check to death. You'll see articles coming out on any claim of shedding, and then you'll get the usual quotes from the experts with all the letters behind their names that shedding is impossible. And then they do a sleight of hand trick, because shedding is actually, there's 2 definitions of shedding. The word shedding has been used in relation to vaccines for a long time. It's usually from like the somewhat deactivated vaccines or somewhat inactivated vaccines. So they're live virus vaccines. So those older class of vaccines, it's known that when you inject someone, I think like with polio, for instance, like some polio virus can then shed. And that's something that they've studied. But that's the virus that they're injecting that can then shed, not the product of the genetic material that then sheds. Because the problem with this, right, this is a gene therapy. They told us it would stay in their arm for a few days, right, not go anywhere else, and that the spike protein antibody production would shut off. We're drowning in evidence that neither of those statements are true. So now you have something with you don't have an endpoint on the production of antibodies, and so this is quite scary, and we're doing these repeatedly, right? It's not like a gene therapy where you give it once. Here, how many boosters are we up to now? How many rounds?
Not only is it not staying in the arm, but with, through this, incredible delivery device of the lipid nanoparticle, can go absolutely everywhere, blood-brain barrier penetration, over testes, everything. Now you're saying it's actually exiting the body somehow. Like how? Is it through the...
Yeah, so you just brought up the second piece to the puzzle. So the first piece is that we have to understand that gene therapies shed, that the FDA knows they shed, that they want studies to be done on shedding. But the other thing that we need to know about these vaccines is they belong to another category of therapeutics. So not only do they fit under the gene therapy category, but they fit under what's called nanoparticle technology. That's the key to your question. So the mRNA is delivered in lipid nanoparticles, and lipid nanoparticles are synthetic, right? They're made in the lab, but they're the natural counterpart to something in our bodies called exosomes. So exosomes are part of how our bodies signal, do cell-to-cell communication. They're almost like little hormones. Lots of communication is done with exosomes. And what happens is when you inject a lipid nanoparticle, the thing about nanoparticles is that they can traverse almost any physiologic barrier. That's why that lie about staying in the arm, there's no nanoparticle technology that's ever stayed where you put it in, because it naturally traverses all boundaries. And so it spreads throughout the body. We have knowledge of that from EMA documents, from FOIA documents, from studies, autopsy studies. You can see that it disseminates throughout. And so going to your question, right? So in order for something to shed, you would need to put genetic material in, make spike antibody. The spike antibody would then have to be taken up by natural exosomes. And that's the key. And so in my document, I kind of did a summary of all the research I've done. But there's an affinity of exosomes for the spike protein. And we have a number of papers showing spike protein within exosomes circulating in the blood. And you can actually find spike protein in breast milk. Exosomes and LNPs are known to cross the placenta, and they're rapidly absorbed in the lung and exhaled through the lung. We think the predominant form of shedding is via the exhaled breath and then someone inhaling that's close by. And once you inhale, they absolutely attach to lung tissue and they diffuse across the cells and they can traverse through the body. So we have the science, we have the evidence for all of it. And again, I base this on other products do the same. And so we know the science is there, but the fact is there was no studies to be done to what extent it is, and this topic is highly censored when you bring it up, because the implications are vast. In fact, myself and my collaborator, who's an anonymous researcher and physician, who goes by a Midwestern doctor, who did a lot of work with me on this. We think that if knowledge of this is understood and disseminated, it's probably we think it'd probably be the greatest driver to get this campaign stopped, of mass vaccinating really the planet with a gene therapy. We have over 1,000 clinical sort of case testimonials that we've been able to review and compile, and it's all part of that document.
Like related to shedding?
Oh, absolutely. We put out a public call, not only on Twitter. The first tweet for that public call got over 500,000 views. I think my retweet got 200,000. And they started to pour in. And first, on my first series, I wrote the series on just the science, and there were so many comments on my post of people relating their personal experiences of getting ill after close exposures to particularly recently vaccinated. And it filled up my comments, and they were so compelling and they were so disturbing that my later post in that series was really just a review of all those testimonials. But then we did it a little bit more aggressively, and at Midwestern Doctor, they spent a lot of time, many, many hours, kind of collating and compiling the general patterns, the reproducibility of this shedding phenomenon.
And I just wanted to mention, Midwestern Doctor, fantastic Substack that, and I think anyone interested in this subject matter would enjoy reading.
Absolutely. One of the best writers on Substack, in my opinion.
So the virus is transmitted through, basically water vapor,
Yep.
right? So in the air, which is interesting. I mean, it tells us a lot about, some of these, 6-foot
Yeah.
distancing. How could that have made any difference? Or masks, how could that have made any difference? Those kinds of questions come up. But you're suggesting that this is the way that this synthetic spike is also transmitted through these exosomes?
It's through exosomes. Those are tiny nanoparticles. I mean, they can float in the air, and they can traverse. We don't know that we know that synthetic lipid nanoparticles can traverse the skin because there's a number of nanoparticle therapeutic products which actually do transcutaneous administration. We don't have evidence that exosomes cross the skin, but we do know that they can be inhaled and then diffuse into the lung tissue.
So, effectively, the transmission is similar? Is that
yes,
what I understand?
similar. It's just not on water vapor. It's just
I see. So just in the air itself.
Exosomes, so it's not a water droplet. An exosome is a lipid sac, so it's a little fatty membrane, and inside it has different sort of enzymes, sometimes growth factors, and genetic material. They're actually mysterious. Exosome science is not old, actually. It used to be thought when they saw exosomes, electron microscopy and microscopy, they thought it was cellular debris. In fact, people, for a long time, scientists didn't know what exosomes were. And now they understand that they're hugely important in the physiology and maintenance of our homeostasis and in repair mechanisms and inflammation. And so it's a whole new area of science. But the scary stuff about those things is that they traverse physiologic barriers and they can disseminate anywhere, and we can absorb them readily. And so that's, for instance, one paper that I cited, which is really shocking, is they looked for antibodies in children of COVID vaccinated parents, hadn't had COVID, and they found IgG antibodies to the spike protein. And if you look at the paper in the abstract conclusion, or in their conclusion, the authors hypothesize that the parents transferred antibodies to the children. And that's why they were measuring antibodies in the children. Now that's a hypothesis. That would suggest that I can get humoral immunity from my parents after birth. We know that some immunity is, by the fetus transplacentally.
Yes.
But I didn't know that when I was born, I got immunity to all the infections that my parents had suffered in their life. No, that's not true. We don't absorb their antibodies. And so for me, the way I interpret that paper is that spike protein was being released in exosomes. The children in the household were absorbing those exosomes and then making antibodies to the spike. And I think either the authors truly believe that, or they couldn't really hypothesize what the case was.
You read these papers. I'm thinking about the paper that talked about the the ribosomal skippage,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
For example, it's a very interesting paper.
The
It's talking
misreading.
about a huge failure of this technology, basically,
Yes.
right? But it's couched in this technology is fantastic. It's all written like
You have to write it. Whatever you say, if it's something that you have to say, this is very, very rare. It's not a big problem. We know these are like people will literally write in those papers, scientific papers, of the most troubling findings, and they'll be like, we know that these vaccines are safe and effective, but we found this little problem. But luckily, it's just a little problem and rare. And because they've been so safe and effective, how could it be a problem? I mean, it's just the circular reasoning.
But at the same time, I think the authors know exactly what they're doing, and they're just trying to get this published. Which kudos to them, right? In a way, because that's their strategy.
That's
right?
what you have to do to get
Right.
it published. You can't say the plain spoken truth about these vaccines and how dangerous they are. But Jan, going back to my point about why I think this would have the greatest power to stop the proliferation and dissemination of this dangerous technology is that if it matters anymore, you're talking about informed consent. I mean, if you start to mass vaccinate an entire population, and now I am at risk of the intervention that you took, and I'm at risk of now being exposed to the spike protein that you're making, and that can make me sick. And then the thing that troubles me the most, right, this multifaceted fraud of these vaccines, each layer that we uncover, my shedding work came on the heels of all the work of like McKernan, where they're finding DNA plasmids, and those plasmids can go into exosomes. So here's my issue. I have never gotten sick from shedding. I'm not sensitive to shedding. I've been around many vaccinated. But what if I am getting DNA plasmids in those exosomes, which have those promoter sequences that could potentially cause cancer? And now my prognosis and my health is now being affected by your intervention. And that is if we still care about medical ethics, bodily autonomy, and informed consent. I haven't seen good evidence of that in the way societies behave. But.
Well, speaking of that, we recently published, this realization that the CDC had prepared an email to talk about the myocarditis signal that they were seeing and then held it back because, it might cause a panic. So, this speaks directly to your question of informed consent, I think.
If they had released that memo, someone would have paid for that. Their masters would have been very angry. We know why they didn't release the memo. The response of this country was vaccines, and they had to promote and protect that campaign as much as possible, even all the danger signals coming out that they've ignored. But it's interesting that you guys found evidence that there was an actual point where someone was about to release a memo, and I can tell you, I don't know how it happened, but someone came in and said, you're not doing that, and they didn't do it.
Well, but what does that say about informed consent?
It's impossible. There is no informed consent. The amount of